Please welcome Stacy Amin and Lawrence Talon to the stage.
Lawrence, thank you for being here. We are so honored that you've traveled from London to join us and to share with us your vision for the future of technology in healthcare and the regulation of technology in healthcare. So before we get started, I'd love to introduce you to our audience. Lawrence Talon is the Chief Executive of the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, called the MHRA. The MHRA is the chief regulator in the UK for medical products, including software and healthcare systems. Lawrence has extensive leadership experience in healthcare before joining the MHRA, including most recently as the Deputy Chief Executive of the Guy's and St Thomas NHS Foundation Trust in London, which is one of the UK's leading health systems. In that role, he led the Trust's approach to technology and innovation strategy and change management. And what important experience to bring to the MHRA at this really critical moment for the agency. The MHRA has been in a period of transition since Brexit, and it's at the point now where it needs to define what role the UK is going to play as a global regulator of healthcare and life sciences. So you're arriving at a really critical moment, which just happens to also be the beginning of the age of AI in healthcare. So we're so honored to have you, and we'd love to hear some opening remarks from you on your vision for the MHRA. And then after those opening remarks, we'll have a little chat about some of the topics that have been discussed here at the summit this week. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Stacy, for having me, and thanks too to Oracle for putting on this fantastic event. I've enjoyed it just as much as I know everyone in the audience has. Let me say a few words about the context in which we're operating overall before I get onto the regulatory side. I think it's pretty clear to all of us that we have some major challenges to solve together in healthcare over the coming years. Clearly, our populations are aging and living many more years in multimorbidity. And this is adding to the costs of healthcare in an unsustainable way. And the costs of healthcare are going up on average a lot more quickly than GDP growth. So this is crowding out other important areas of public expenditure like education, defense, and others. And on the supply side, we know that there is projected to be a shortfall of some 10 million healthcare workers around the globe by 2030, much of that in the global south, and it's clearly, again, not ethical or sustainable for rich countries like the US and the UK to keep taking more and more workers from the global south. In my own country, in the UK, the satisfaction with health services 15 years ago was relatively high. Some 3 in 5 people said they were either very satisfied or satisfied with health services in the UK 15 years ago. That's down to 1 in 5, just slightly better than 1 in 5 today. So we have some urgent work to do. However, on the positive side of the ledger, we now have the most incredible tools and opportunities available to us by the twin revolutions of biotechnology and digital technology and AI. So the solutions are starting to come into view for how we can do things that were just unimaginable even a generation ago. For example, this incredible problem we've had for the last generation more around obesity, affecting a third of people in my country, similar numbers in the US. We can now start to solve this problem with this new group of GLP-1 medications. Cancer, affecting 1 in 2 people in their lifetimes, we can now bring forward a new generation of cancer immunotherapies personalized to the patient and offer hope for many more years of healthy life. And those people, those 1 in 20 people who have a rare disease and who in the past have had really very few treatment options, we can now offer those people hope for diseases such as sickle cell, where we can effectively cure sickle cell in certain people with gene therapies. So we have these enormous possibilities. AI can not only make healthcare faster and more accurate, but it can also deal with this cost equation by automating so many tasks that help to address the shortfall of healthcare workers. But we need AI not only to work in a research sense, but in an applied sense, in the real world, to help us transform healthcare to be better, faster, and fairer at a lower unit cost and at scale. Now, we're going to need many things to make that work, but one of them is a regulatory framework for AI in healthcare that is pro-innovation. And so my theme in this job overall, and my theme for my comments today, will be how we can get regulation working at the pace of innovation.
Well, this audience is certainly going to be very excited to hear you say pro-innovation is your goal at the MHRA. And I'd like to start off our fireside chat with a personal question. So you've had a fascinating career, but as an executive in the healthcare sector, not really as a regulator. So can you share with us a bit about how your personal background and experience has shaped the way you approach being a regulator?
Yeah, sure, Stacy. I think it's fair to say when you come to a conference like this filled with frontline healthcare leaders, tech innovators, when you're the guy who comes on as the regulator, you're not really expecting fireworks to be going off in the background and cheers from the audience. But I'm relatively new to regulation, as you say. I started around about 6 months ago. I have to say, though, that I have the most profound respect for what I've found, not only in my own agency in the MHRA, but in peer agencies such as the FDA and others around the country. The level of expertise and the commitment to public service in these organizations is phenomenal, and we shouldn't ever underestimate that. But I also bring the lens of someone who's run frontline healthcare services for most of their career in academic medical centers, often being the one working with clinical trialists to work out how we get through the regulatory framework. So I see regulation from that lens. And in fact, in my last role, I was also limited partner on a medtech investment fund. So I kind of get that entrepreneur's journey and that investor's journey, and I know the pain points, I feel the pain points that many of you in this room have as your daily life. But I think perhaps most importantly, the third lens I bring is the lens of the patient view. Because I'm someone whose whole life trajectory has been shaped by access to clinical innovation, to clinical trial. You see, when I was a teenager, my mother was diagnosed with a late-stage cancer, and really statistically should have died when I was still a teenager, 15 or 16. But we were lucky that our hometown was Cambridge, not Cambridge, Massachusetts, Cambridge, the original Cambridge. And so she was enrolled in a clinical trial at Cambridge University Hospitals, one of the most phenomenal institutions in our country and certainly globally. And thanks to the access to that clinical trial, she lived many more years than she should. And so we did, of course, eventually lose our mother, but when I was an adult and able to cope. And my guiding mission is how can I help other people, other patients and families, not only in my country, but as far and wide as possible, to have those same sort of opportunities, to have more years of healthy life and more years with their loved ones.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, and it's really wonderful to hear your very mission-driven approach to your role, and I think we all would share that mission in this audience too. And I would love to next follow up a bit on AI, which of course has been the main topic of discussion at this conference. And I wonder if you could say a bit about how you're planning to look at the regulation of AI in the UK and how the MHRA can create an agile regulatory regime for AI that still protects patients. Thank you.
Yeah, so you've got the sense of urgency that we feel in our country to address the healthcare challenges ahead. And our government has recently published two very important plans, one for the health sector and one for the life sciences sector. And there is a really strong aspiration for the UK to be one of the safest and fastest places to develop, adopt and deploy AI at scale in healthcare. And a crucial part of that is updating and modernizing the regulatory framework. Our regulatory framework was essentially designed for an era before AI. So we're going to kick off soon a major national exercise looking at how we can reform the regulation of AI in healthcare, and I'll be able to say more about that in the coming weeks, but it's been trailed in those plans that I described. And I have as my watchwords pace and prudence. It sounds a bit like a Jane Austen title. Pace, because we cannot afford to let this technology pass us by and fail to bring these opportunities to patients. We have to reform our health system urgently. But we need to be prudent, because there is nothing that will set back the pace of reform more certainly than some egregious safety failures. And we must keep patients safe, and we must maintain public confidence. So we have to have prudence, but we have to have pace, and finding that balance is crucial. And I like to think about my role as a regulator as not telling patients and frontline caregivers exactly what they should and shouldn't do, but helping to frame for them the architecture of choice, deciding which products or things are simply not safe or effective enough, or some other way unpalatable and should not be presented as choices to frontline caregivers and patients, which are so safe and effective that they become the standard of care, and the default is that's what you have unless you choose to opt out. But in between, in an age of AI and biological medicines, there is a significant array there of choice, where a particular patient with their caregiver, well informed by the data and the evidence and the regulatory communication, should be able to make the choice that best suits them in their circumstances.
That's great. I love your framing of that as a choice architecture for patients with pace and prudence. And let me switch gears a bit to the role that technology could play in potentially changing the way sponsors bring products to market. Do you have thoughts you could share on this?
Yeah. So I think, AI is really changing the regulatory paradigm in at least three ways. The first way is that we need to be using AI a lot more in our own regulatory processes, both for sponsors to be able to submit their files in advance and get a quick check, a quick readout about anything that's likely to come up in the regulatory process, and for us as regulators to be able to smooth that process and make it much faster. We're starting to do that in the MHRA and clinical trials, and we've radically reduced the time it takes to assess some files. But that's just some part of the workflow, and we need to do it across the board. Clearly, we know the FDA has made good moves in this area as well, and other international regulators. So that's one way. The other way, the second way, is AI within the drug development process and combined products. And this is a really, really novel, complex area for us, where we as regulators need to work with developers, with industry, with academics, to understand how we're going to regulate this complex area, and when we're regulating something as part of the production process, and when we're regulating it as part of the medical device process. And then the third one is that one around the medical device process, where we're going to have more and more opportunities for AI to be guiding clinical decisions, or even recommending certain diagnoses and treatment pathways. And up to now, for those products, I think we would probably, if I did a straw poll, I think if I said to you how many people think that the regulations are not onerous enough, I don't think many hands would go up. I think if I said how many of them think they're too onerous, I think a lot of hands would go up. And maybe a number would say something in between, but I think more people would say it's too onerous rather than not enough. And the concepts I'd like to share with you about how I want to change this regulatory paradigm is the concept of a hurdles race rather than a high jump. And what I mean by that is we have, at the moment, our regulatory paradigm puts in place a very, very high bar to market entry or to patient access, depending on how you look at it. And that's partly because we then are not confident that we will know what happens in the real world. So we put a very, very high jump in your way. But what I want to see is something that looks more akin to a hurdles race, with smaller, proportionate steps along the way, with the developer being able to hit the ground running in between. So do we have a responsible developer that's built the right safeguards into their product? Do we have good data from adaptive trials, including potentially real-world data? Do we have an appropriate marketing authorization? Have we credentialed the institution that's using this product to check that they know how they're going to use it in their clinical workflow? And have we got really good post-market surveillance data? So I see a series of more proportionate hurdles allowing developers to get products to patients more quickly, and us using the data that these products generate to be able to know and monitor the real-world effect.
I love that concept of the hurdles rather than the high jump. And I think you're absolutely right, though, that it's going to depend on having a really modernized post-market surveillance system. And so, can you say more about, how you view the role for hospitals and healthcare providers in creating that modernized post-market surveillance system?
So I think the post-market surveillance system of the future is the absolute key to unlocking the new regulatory paradigm. And as I say, at the moment, our regulatory paradigm puts all the onus on the pre-market decision and comparatively little on the post-market surveillance. But the nature of these products means we can get real-time data. So I think one of the reasons I'm so excited to be in this conference, Stacy, is I think pretty much everyone in this room can align around a shared vision between regulators, healthcare leaders, technologists, to build a post-market data architecture that is absolutely world-class in terms of safety, can really be confident that we will pick up safety signals quickly in the real world, and that in turn allows us this more proportionate approach to marketing authorization, because we know that there will always be things that become apparent as you move from the relatively small sample from a clinical trial into the real world. There will always be things that become apparent that weren't evident in the clinical trial. If we've got a really good safety surveillance system, we can allow those products in knowing we'll pick those issues up. And of course, what that requires is data architects, hence me being so excited to be with the people here. And if we look at the multiple data feeds we can get from hospital EHRs, primary care, community pharmacies, consumer data, applying natural language processing to the text that comes out of ambient scribes, there is a vast amount we can do to improve patient safety and promote innovation by better post-market surveillance.
I think that's music to all of our ears in this audience. And I wonder, are you also thinking about the power of post-market surveillance in the life sciences context as well, the power to create real-world data that could be used in submissions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we all know that if we've got a vast array of very exciting products that we're going to be able to make available to patients, whether digital therapeutics, biological medicines. But we're going to have to find ways to make clinical trials faster and less expensive if we want to realize those opportunities on behalf of our patients. One of the important ways we can do that is better application of real-world data. Because when we look at the clinical trial environment, often we're talking about pretty small sample sizes. Sometimes, with rare and very rare disease, incredibly small sample sizes. And we must find ways, and certainly the MHRA is very keen to do this, to allow people to use real-world data in their filing applications. And in fact, we're publishing a series of guidance documents, and I would be delighted to hear people's feedback. Those generally go for consultation before we finalize on how we can better use real-world data for this more proportionate approach to marketing authorization.
That's great. We'll look forward to seeing those guidance documents. So I'd like to shift gears again a bit from an industry perspective, share one of the aspects of regulation that we find most challenging for a global company is, trying to navigate so many different regulatory approaches around the world. And of course, they're all developing and changing quickly, trying to react to AI. How do you think about the importance of international partnerships and harmonization, and what are your goals in this regard?
So international reciprocity between regulators is absolutely key to my plans for the future of our agency. And if we look at the basic equation facing regulators like mine and others around the world, we have to specialize in those areas that align the regulatory science to the core scientific and technological strengths of your particular country. In our case, that would be things like cell and gene therapies, cancer vaccines, AI as a medical device, and others. So we want to concentrate our specialist expertise around those areas. But we have also to be comprehensive and to cover the full range of products coming available to patients. We have to do it in a timely fashion, and we have to live within finite resources. So how do you square that circle? The only way is greater international reliance and recognition between trusted regulatory partners. That, of course, has the benefit to developers and your regulatory affairs teams of not having to file multiple different documents to multiple different regulators. That, at the moment, is quite a piecemeal picture, I know. But what you'll see from the MHRA in the months and years ahead is a real push, a real drive to work with our peer regulators. Now, clearly, the most important regulator around the world in this space is the FDA, and I'm very, very keen to continue to build on the already good relationships we have with the FDA and to work ever more closely with that institution. We also, though, have very important relationships still into Europe and with our Access Consortium countries. This is Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, and the UK. 5 quite like-minded peer countries and organisations who can reciprocate with each other's standards. And of course, being the UK, we have very strong linguistic and historical links to some of the major economies of Asia and Africa, which we want to build on as part of this regulatory reciprocity. So I completely recognise the point that we need greater harmonisation. That will allow us to bring products to patients more quickly. It's much more efficient for developers, and we haven't got it right. But that's something that certainly the MHRA will be looking to lead the way on in the years ahead.
That's great to hear. Thank you. So I want to raise a topic that has ended up being a really powerful topic this week at the summit, which is clinical trials and access to clinical trials. We heard some, really powerful comments this week about how the availability of clinical trials shouldn't be left to chance or, who you happen to know or be connected with. So I wonder if you could share a bit about, whether you have any goals related to clinical trials in the UK.
Yeah, I can, Stacey. And you'll have understood from my comments earlier that this is a subject that's both deeply personal for me as well as professional. And I think reflecting on the way you've introduced the question, I guess my own experience, good one though it was somewhat a matter of fortune. It happens to be which town you live in or what your local hospital is, and it shouldn't be like that. It should be that any patient presenting with whatever the condition should have the same access to clinical trials. I think it would be fair to say, in the spirit of candour and openness with this audience, that the MHRA went through a rocky period, particularly after Brexit, because we had the combination of Brexit and then the COVID pandemic, where our agency before my time did fantastic work around approving the vaccine in record time, but it meant all the other non-COVID work built up. The combination of that and our difficult separation from Europe, meant that the MHRA got on the back foot for quite a while around clinical trials. I'm happy to say we are well through that difficult period now. We're back into a position where we are meeting all of our performance targets around clinical trials. Most of those targets are time-bound, and I want to move not only to time-bound, but quality-bound, quality markers as well as time markers. But I think the UK government has really set its stall out to regain its preeminent position for clinical trials. And if you look at our academic output as a country, we're third in the world, only behind the US and China. We must get to a stage where we are seen like that as well as a destination for clinical trials and have the right commercial environment. So the government set out a plan with a number of features. The first is to measure the whole life cycle of the clinical trial, because I know there's nothing more frustrating for your regulatory affairs teams or your trialists, your principal investigators, when one agency does their bit, but it just moves the bottleneck down to another part of the chain. You've got to look at the whole life cycle. And so our government has set out a target to reduce the time from trial application to first patient from a current average of around 250 days to 150 days or fewer. The second thing that they're doing is being much more transparent with the data. So we will be able to see which sites are performing well in terms of trial recruitment, which hospitals are performing well in terms of trial recruitment, and which are not. And trialists can then move their trials accordingly. And alongside that data, the incentives will flow so that the money will flow to those that are mobilising their trials quickly and away from those that aren't. And then the other two things are to sort out the contracting, because it should be one of the advantages of a single-payer system like the UK National Health Service, that you can have streamlined national contracting. But of course, those of you that have set up trials in the UK will know we haven't leveraged that advantage. And then the other crucial things we're doing are a really significant investment in the data environment. So £600 million investment. I can't quite do the calculation in dollars, but you can work it out. To curate the single-payer architecture we have in the UK, to make that available for researchers. And then finally, we have a relatively new innovation that came out of COVID called the NHS app, which is a single portal for anyone in the country to be able to access their health services. And that will now become a portal signposting patients to relevant clinical trials to them.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you. So a topic I have not actually heard as much about this week, but I am very keen to get your views on is cybersecurity, because you have experience from both sides of this topic as both an NHS executive as well as now a regulator of cybersecurity, particularly in medical devices. So I wonder if you can comment on any future policy direction in the UK on this topic.
Yeah, sure. So this is a subject that I speak with quite bitter experience about. The threat level is clearly escalating. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, of course, is the geopolitical environment, where there are many countries or many actors, whether independent actors or with state sponsorship, who would seek to attack countries like the US, the UK, and our allies. We then have the technological improvements and the potential for quantum computing to completely change the game on the cyber threat. Now, as it happens, I think healthcare is increasingly being seen as a relatively softer target compared to financial services. And in the UK, although the government has a very clear policy that it will never pay ransomware attacks, we still see ransomware attempts, despite the fact that there will never be a payoff at the end of it. And the reason that this is a bit of experience for me is in my last role, running hospital services in London, our organisation suffered one of the worst cyber attacks in healthcare, certainly in our country, but probably one of the worst around the world. It wasn't actually on our organisation itself, it was on our pathology provider. But of course, very often the problem isn't in the main enterprise, it's in the supply chain to that main enterprise. Mm-hmm. And what we found for a substantial number of weeks was, because our pathology provider went down, those of you that work in hospitals will know that the hospital really grinds to a halt. And a lot of things had to go from electronic processes to paper and pen, and we couldn't reliably match blood samples for transfusions. So we had to actually go to universal donor blood products, O-negative blood products, and actually drained the national stocks of universal donor blood. So this was actually a nationally significant issue because of that impact on the blood supply in the country. So this is an enormously important issue. And of course, there is a tension between innovation and particularly these kind of small, scrappy startups that have got exciting products, but there will always be a tension about whether corners could be cut in terms of cybersecurity, and the way, of course, that venture capital works, with startups having to really, really have a load of pressure to grow their top-line revenues, sign more customers. We have to ask ourselves, will there be a temptation sometimes to cut corners? And the more you do that, the more you open up doors into your main enterprise. And it is the supply chain risk, really, that we need to worry about. So I guess my word of caution is that we all must substantially invest in cybersecurity and through the supply chain. And the crucial thing for those of us who are or have been running large enterprises is not simply to rely on a paper checklist assurance, but to properly audit the supply chain, because it is likely that there will be some assurance in there that you will want to probe. And I kind of think about this as driving down the freeway without a belt on. You might be fine, you might get lucky, but if you're not, it's the worst possible scenario. So cybersecurity is essential to us actually promoting the innovation we all want to see.
Those are some great words of caution, too, to our audience members. So I think we have time for just one last question, and I would like to bring it back to what has been probably the major theme, I think, of discussion at this summit around generative AI and its power in healthcare. And just particularly to discuss how with generative AI, you have these tools, ChatGPT, we had OpenAI executive speaking yesterday. Really the speed with which we can develop new clinical decision support tools, I think is, beyond anything we could have fathomed when medical device laws were written. And, just how are you thinking about generative AI in particular and the ability to just quickly generate so many bespoke AI agents across the sector?
I mean, this is so exciting, but it does present challenges. We all do. We're all using generative AI, whichever product you're using in your, I won't say any for fear of plugging one product, not another, but we all use that in our work. And I've probably been using it regularly for about two years or so in my own work. And the advances that technology has made is incredible in that time. I mean, things that were a bit clunky when you first started using it, and also because you're learning as a user how to use it, it is just moving so quickly. So I think my overall impression here is that these are tools that clinicians are already using. So this plane is already in flight. We as regulators don't have the option to say, come into land and we'll tell you when you can take off, because it's already happening. Our role has to be to carefully guide the flight path to a safe but still agile route, rather than say you can't use it until we've regulated everything, because it's happening. I come back to my analogy about high jump rather than hurdles. So if we were to say we're going to look at every possible way that this generative AI tool could be used in healthcare, of course there will be some things that could happen if you say the wrong thing or it would hallucinate. But if we have a series of proportionate checks along the way to mitigate those risks, then we can capture the enormous benefit while mitigating those risks. And one of my frames of reference for this, before I came down here to Orlando, I was in Boston and Connecticut, and I went to visit a fantastic friend and colleague of mine, Barry Stein, who's the Chief Clinical Information Officer at Hartford Healthcare. Some of you may know him. And the system that they have developed up there in Hartford to really think thoughtfully about how they use generative AI and AI within their clinical workflows is really second to none. And my feeling is that we shouldn't have the regulator saying everything depends on the regulatory decision. We should credential the institution to say this is a developer that is responsible, that's built the right safeguards in place, and that will give us the right post-market surveillance data we need to be able to monitor safety signals. And this is a clinical organization that has thought carefully about how they will deploy AI within their clinical practice, and has got the right governance and ethical framework around how to do that, and will also report as necessary. So I'm looking at much more at credentialing the process and the institutions involved in that process. That's not to say, of course, we won't credential the product, but it's really impossible to make the whole thing sit around just the accreditation of the product. So that's the basic mindset that I'll be deploying. And over the course of the next year, we'll be fundamentally reforming how we do regulation of AI as a medical device in the UK. And we'll be doing that working very closely with our key international partners, certainly the FDA, and also a really important global institution called Health AI, which is an NGO out of Geneva that's helping global regulators think through how to set best practice, which in turn should harmonize standards for developers bringing products to market and solutions to patients.
Well, thank you. This was a fantastic conversation. I think our audience has really enjoyed it. I know I have. And we are really excited to see how you're going to be changing, what change you'll make at the MHRA. So
thank you, Stacy, and thank you for
so
having
much.
me.